Florida. It's a colored waiting room because, of course, everything was, sorry, I've just got a recording thing. The waiting rooms, of course, were segregated. Oops, sorry. Right. Okay, good. Yeah, so you see there's certain kinds of resemblances, and you can see how he took it and made it into a more abstract kind of image. I thought this was really interesting because it reminded me very much of some of the photographs of Dorothea Lange's work, with people on the side of the road in cars heading away from problems. Okay, so this is where I wanted to get to. So he said, my folks used to talk about these lynchings. I was aware of these things, but not in an intellectual way. As a youngster, you just hear stories. This was really the time of the migration. I didn't know the term migration, but I remember people used to tell us when a new family would arrive. The people in the neighborhood would collect clothes for these newcomers and pick out coals that hadn't burned completely in the furnace to get them started. I didn't see the migration as an historical event, but people were talking about it. That was prior to our moving to Harlem. The emotional power of this panel is both what is not there, the body that once hung from the noose, and the mourner's body which collapses under the weight of sorrow, but also fear of the ever-present threat of meeting the same fate. Lawrence also included a panel that highlighted the devastating floods of 1915 and 1916 as a motivating force behind the migration that Scott had mentioned in his book. And Lawrence likely would have had in mind the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, still the most destructive river flood in US history, involving 27,000 square miles of land, leaving countless farms and towns underwater and displacing up to 1 million people, most of them Black. Images of train stations, waiting rooms, and railroad cars filled with people leaving and arriving at new environments recur throughout the series, providing a rhythmic marker of time and representing movement as a break with a seemingly immovable foundation. Lawrence also depicted the process of acculturation and increased fluency in new modes of living, as seen here with people voting for the first time, children writing numbers on a school board, and the availability of more nourishing food. The panels present a narrative arc of the past, present, and future for these migrants, including the individual agency involved in their decisions. The interweaving of image and written captions in the series allows Lawrence to explore and reveal the multiple dimensions of the story he wanted to tell. The visual images are not intended as literal representations of what was expressed in the written historical accounts about events and emotions. Through his use of certain colors, shapes, and forms, Lawrence's aim is to show the excitement, the crowds, the tension, to achieve a surge of movement in every panel. Even as his style becomes more abstract, with more purposeful distinction, the human figure remains the most important element. The work is abstract in the sense of having been designed and composed, but it is not abstract in the sense of having no human contact. In this sense, his paintings set him apart from other social realist artists in that he presented African-American everyday experience and histories in more subtle and sensorial form. All of these artists fuse the discursive with the aesthetic, drawing attention to the politics of the everyday, including its occurrence under conditions of abject poverty, systemic racism, and confinement, and the materialities underpinning their message, the material, medial, and technologized ecology that constitute their work: paint, canvas, camera, iPhone, WhatsApp, nature, object, and word, illustrates how the interplay between the human and the environment and the verbal and the visual is constituted, and how it can alter and enhance our understanding of particular phenomenon. So I want to end my talk now with a depiction in a short film of perhaps the most significant aspect of migration, the moment of departure. Departures are rarely the beginning for migrants. The final moments before they leave come after many tough choices are made, sometimes terrifying escapes, hopeful realizations, dangers encountered, loved ones anguished over, and stark realities confronted. Cumulative experiences that can be very difficult to recall, let alone reduce to words. And migrations forced on people by war or sudden changes in regimes or local economies involve a particularly urgent pressure about leaving home. I first saw this short film at the 2018 Manhattan Short Film Festival, a unique international festival in which audience members choose their top 3 best films, actors, and directors, casting their votes after the screenings. And then after a certain months go by, the winners are announced. This is a film that did win one of the prizes, but I was just so impressed by it the moment I saw it. It just spoke so much to me, and particularly, as you will notice, there is very, very little speaking in it. So it's almost a silent movie. And this is what interested me too about the film. The film, it's entitled Mare Nostrum, was written and directed by Anas Khalaf and Rana Kazkaz, Syrian filmmakers living outside Syria who wanted to explore the impact of the violence in Syria on its citizens. So I think now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and the film will be shown from your end, right? So I'll stop sharing and
thank you very much. Now I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. That's where the movie is, so I should find it. Is it full screen now?
No, not from my view anyway.
Now it works, right? Ignore, could
Yep.
you help me? Yeah, thank you. So. sorry.
The large number of migrant tragedies in the Mediterranean Sea hasn't slowed down the amount of people hoping to reach Europe. In the most recent incident, officials for the United Nations Refugee Agency confirmed that at least 47 migrants of multiple nationalities drowned last night when their boat sank. However, rescuers did find 29 survivors in the water, among them a 6-year-old Syrian girl.
Would you like me to stop screening?
I just have a few just a little bit to close comments. So the harrowing images of the father throwing his daughter repeatedly into the sea to do his best to ensure her survival, the filmmakers effectively capture, using very few words, the moments or events that occur before people depart from their homes, when tough choices propelled by hope and despair must be considered. The contrast between the complex structures of feeling captured by the filmmakers and the near impossibility of unfolding these layers in verbal or written accounts acquired through a series of questions and answers designed to exclude could not be starker. In his writing on language, Bourdieu always insisted that the power of language was not invoked linguistically, but that authority comes to language from the outside. Hence the difficulty of challenging socially pre-established grounds of legitimate meanings and forms of expression. For Bourdieu, where language has no prior authorization, it cannot produce new forms of legitimacy. This would require a break with social conventions and modes of practice, both inscribed in language and embodied or enacted through dominant practices and institutions. This leads me to the question in the case of translation of how to go about expanding authorized discourses to reinvigorate a more productive transnational dialogue about migration. In the same way, the British New Left cultural critic Raymond Williams was clear that dominant structures of feeling operating in society through powerful individuals and institutions can only be transformed by struggle and by action, a task he viewed as involving not only political, economic, cultural, and educational reform, but also feeling and imagination, not in their weakest senses, imagining the future, which for him was a waste of time, or the emotional side of things, but as vital and immediate resources for bringing about change. My point here is that where the aim of translation is to bring to fuller consciousness the experiences of the unrepresented and misrepresented, whose stories, as Rothko said of his paintings, could be impaired by the eyes of the vulgar and the cruelty of the impotent, more innovative ways are called for that encourage what Folkart calls a writerly approach to translation. This entails a fully embodied dialogic articulation of the not yet comprehensible that allows the unsaid and the unseen to proceed with fewer obstacles. A remaking of the text that involves not replicating the fossilized remnants of language at its surface, but revealing the direct presentation of structures of feeling waited there to be pierced or punctured. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Moira Ingler, for this very insightful talk. We may proceed with Q&A. We may get a couple of questions. If you have any questions, you may either take over or use the chat box, however you prefer. Any questions from the audience? Let me see the chat box. Iram has a question, I guess. Can you turn on the sound, Iram? I guess Iram is joining.
The sound is on. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah. So welcome, Iram.
Thank you so much. Professor Ingler, thank you so much for this fascinating talk.
Hello,
and it's so nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
My question is, I was actually wondering, in your research, have you encountered any comments made by the photographers who took the images you shared? I think I'm thinking photographers here as ethnographers. So I just thought that it would be interesting to hear the aspects they thought should compel or encourage us, the viewers, to think about the context of the image rather than simply receiving an overall impression. I guess I'm curious whether you found anything they say about the images they took, any element or any detail within the photograph that they think should distract us. Like, for instance, do they say something about the head or the gaze of the migrant that doesn't meet that of the spectator? So have you encountered any, like ethnographic eye type of observation from the photographers?
Yeah, well, thanks. That's a really great question. I don't actually, this research, I'm not doing research I have not done ethnographic work myself with photographers, although it's very interesting. It's something I'm sort of pursuing, but not in any kind of direct or certainly research-oriented way yet. But I think we could just talk about Dorothea Lange for a moment. She really started her career as a portrait photographer. She was basically she had studios where people would come and she would sit them and she would help pose them, and she created her art in that way, right? So her move into this work for the FSA really was mostly through her husband's work. He was, in a sense, it wasn't ethnography, but it was also, but he was an economist, so he was actually working to report on the conditions, as I mentioned in the talk, for the farm laborers. And she came along, because of her interest in what he was doing, but also in her interest in photography. And so in many ways, she became that kind of photographer by just being, but they would just go out on the road and for, months, weeks and months. She didn't speak very much to the people that she was taking pictures of. And she did also, in some cases, pose them, in the way that she would have done in her studio. And I know that there's a lot of, so there's a lot of issues around, whether that, what kind of ethical, or unethical, as it might be, to create photographs in that way. But they were really trying to, not just write about the conditions, but actually, show the conditions. And I would say that her work was incredibly important in bringing about a lot of change in the conditions of the farm workers in that period at that time. So, I don't know if that doesn't really answer your question. My question is, I guess my point is that I see her as kind of becoming an ethnographer, but no ethnographer would really do what she did. You know what I mean? So she was a photographer more than that, but I don't think that, I personally think that, her attempts to get a better photograph was, in a sense, the way I see it anyway, is kind of how I'm kind of trying to relate this to written accounts, or when you listen to somebody's actual account of what's happened to them, their experiences as a refugee or an asylum seeker, that they need help sometimes in framing their stories in a way that make them more reachable, make them more, make the listener more sensitive to what actually experiences that the experiences that they had were like, right? And that's what strikes me about this film, is that the photographers were able to do that, and we were able to watch this experience. It's an experience that is completely hidden from most narratives, because most narratives start at the point of either with a general, explanation for why somebody's either seeking asylum or has fled somewhere, but they never really get to the heart of the matter, and so I feel like, just as Dorothea Lange helped people look at those photographs in a particular way, that's the kind of thing that I'm, trying to figure out how interpreters and translators can do the same. And in some ways, I'm both kind of thinking about how we can do the same to the written word and the spoken word, but also whether or not images should play more of a role, right, in the institutional processes that are going along, that are happening, where many decisions are getting made as to whether people deserve to be, to be allowed to stay, or permanently or temporarily, in a place to which they've ended up after leaving a very difficult situation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have more questions?
Özlem Hocam, somebody else raised hand. I guess Ebru Diriker Hocam as well.
Sure.
Okay, may I?
Sure.
All right. Thank you, Moira, for a very, very insightful talk. It reminded me of a lot of things I thought while I was interpreting for asylum proceedings. And what you said at the beginning, the fact that when something repeats, it starts to create less and less impact. So as an interpreter, when you work in an asylum setting, the fact that the narratives are made to resemble each other immensely because of the institutional framework creates some kind of a distance, some kind of, I would say, a lack of empathy if you're repeating yourself over and over again. And I know you think about these issues a lot. So what would you say would be a good way for interpreters who are themselves repeating narratives which actually have all this background, but is devoid of all context in an asylum setting? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I wish there was a, you know, I don't have a clear answer to that. I know that, I mean, I think, well, I guess the way I would, you know, answer that question is to sort of create a context for the context in which these things happen, right? So, you know, there may be nothing an interpreter can do, is what I want to say, because we know that, you know, and I did, you know, I did work in this area, you know, many decades ago. So I understand, you know, the importance of helping shape the narrative before the asylum seeker gets to the place where they're being interrogated and being, you know, considered. That often doesn't happen. And in my research in the UK, when I was doing that work, I couldn't, it was clear that if a person had already spoken to a legal advisor or a lawyer or somebody who helped them to shape a narrative that actually was compelling, that they often, there was no doubt in my mind that they were heard in different ways, right? So so there's lots of problems with some of those stories that are repeated are not very well constructed, right? And so that is partly that because they're not prepared ahead of time, right? A lot of people are just coming in, you know, for an interview, right? Often without any legal counsel or legal advice before they get there, right? So there's that. So that the shape of the narrative is never going to be that, you know, as good as it could be, right? And then some people are told to say things in certain ways, you know, to make a compelling narrative. And so what happens is they're all told to say, for example, and I even when I say these words, I feel like I'm, you know, talking, it's just part of the problem. You know, they're told to say they've been tortured, for example, right? You know, that is something that becomes, even if they haven't been. So what happens is people start telling stories with a very familiar, you know, themes and you know, the experiences become repetitive, partly because people are told to say things sometimes in order to convince, you know, to be more convincing. And so, you know, it's not just about, you know, it's not just about what an interpreter can do. It's all that goes behind, you know, all that comes to the interpreter, you know, before they even get a chance to think about how to help shape it. But okay, so to your question, you know, I guess you know, I've always sort of, you know, since writing about interpreting and translation, I've always, you know, particularly in this kind of area, I've always emphasized that these are stories, these are narratives, they're stories, right? And so if you're an interpreter who is also a translator and has translated fiction, has translated, you know, fictionalized stories, has translated, anything that has a kind of, story-like structure, to remember that even though the delivery of this story might be very truncated because it's usually question and answer, that to try and remember that it is a story that has a kind of shape and that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And to sort of think of it more, that's why I brought Barbara Folkert's work into this when I was thinking about this, because she talks about translation, the way she talks about translation, and I point out several times, she doesn't mean only literary work. She doesn't mean only poetry. She means any kind of technical, scientific manual. All of the things that she says about literary and poetic language are also relevant to that kind of language, so that you can find, you can try to find the unsaid. You can try to do the remaking, whether you're talking about a technical document or a literary one. And sometimes I feel that, and things that I've seen personally, and then filmed in interviews that I've seen, I think interpreters can lose sight of that they're actually trying to help someone tell a story, and that's, how you can do that. I would think that you would be much more capable of thinking about how that could come about than me, because you're such an experienced interpreter. But you know what I mean? That's kind of, I think it's sort of just, it could be as simple as just shifting one's perception of what one is doing and what one is involved in. But then there's also why I said what I said at the beginning is that, interpreters are not, they can't break through really tough, institutional discourses that are not really conducive to that, so it's a tough job. It's a challenge, and I wouldn't say that an interpreter should feel that it's their responsibility to, make that happen when there's so much working against it at the geopolitical level, at the institutional, the social institutional level. So, it's that's my answer, I think, to what you've said. But I think it's not hopeless. I think it's still worth thinking about. What one can do, right? Despite the fact that we know that if someone's coming in to be determined for refugee or asylum status, there's a lot of strikes against that person from the very beginning, before they've even uttered a word, right? So we must always remember that, and the interpreters are not magicians. They're not, they can't make something happen that isn't, and poof, it goes away. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Diriker. So I would ask a similar question as an interpreter. You talked about moving as close as possible to what has not been mentioned yet. And I would ask you how we could do that as interpreters. And given your answer, I thought of empathy. Do you think empathy could work, or what could work in the case of the interpreters or translators?
Well, I mean, empathy cannot, I don't think empathy could ever be not an important thing to have, when you're doing that kind of work. Look, I'm going to be really frank, though. I think, there are people who come, to apply for things that you might not have empathy for. You might think, oh, this doesn't sound right to me, or there's, a refugee or an asylum seeker is it's not always telling the truth, right? And I say that, not because I don't blame them for not telling. They're trying to get something, right? When we need something and we feel this is our last resort, we can all not tell the truth, right? So I'm not making a moral judgment on that. So I think interpreters, can be affected by that, right? They can be affected by this. They can hear other people, and hear their stories, and then have somebody come along and they think this just can't be, I'm not buying this myself. So, you're a human being, you're going to kind of have different feelings about what you're hearing. But I think in general, empathy, it should be had on both sides of, the interpreters should have the empathy, and so should the asylum officers or, the immigration officials, right? And immigration officials, get burnt out, right? So, I mean, I really don't sort of see some utopia. I'm not trying to establish any sort of utopia. We can have a utopian vision, but that's different than thinking that we'll get to a full blown paradise. But, I do think that, it's hard to be an interpreter and work in these kinds of conditions, because it's also, I would say that empathy, yes, but I also think interpreters who are doing that kind of work need really a lot of support. And, when I was doing my research, decade ago or more in England, when I was working with the interpreters who were working at the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture, all of the volunteer counselors and the full-time counselors at the Medical Foundation got counseling themselves because of the work that they were doing every single day. And the interpreters, when I was there, they had finally fought and got an interpreter coordinator. And one of the first things they asked for was counseling, was therapy, even if it was in the form of group conversation, but also in, individual counseling, because people kept forgetting that they were also just as affected by what was being said and what was going on in the interactions. But because they're supposedly invisible, they weren't getting any, they weren't getting that recognition, so I think it'd be a lot easier for interpreters to be more empathetic, I think, if they kind of could wash some of the, the effects of the day, every day, or, once a week or a couple of times a week with other interpreters, and really think, have help in thinking about how to stay empathetic, but also how to save oneself from, you have to go home to families and et cetera. So I think it needs to kind of work both ways as well. I would hate to say, if you have to be empathetic as an interpreter, yeah, like, of course, but, then let's figure out a way to make that possible, In fact, one of the reasons that I started when I wrote the paper, What is Red, I wasn't really thinking about their art as actual, it wasn't related to, like, in the way that the artists and writers that I was talking about today. But it was in response to something that I'd read and something that Carol Mayer had written about an interpreter who just was crushed, when she was listening to somebody speak about something that, as a single mother, that was a domestic violence situation, something along those lines. And she just couldn't bear the emotion of it all, And so that's kind of where that was my starting point for going to look at how these artists had experienced similar things, and how they dealt with it, But so that sort of that was more just using their art to kind of make parallels. This talk is much more about thinking about how art and art forms can actually express emotion, and trying to learn something from that as well.
Thank you very much. Shirin Tufan, the floor is yours.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, because I had a problem with the computer, so now I am trying to talk from the phone, so I hope I'll work it out. Well, thank you very much for the talk. It was so insightful, and it brought me back to the years when I was back in England 20 years ago, and when I was also doing some interpreting for the asylum seekers. And there were so many cases when, as you said, as interpreters, we can just see that people are telling stories and we don't buy it. But there was one particular case which is still daunting me for all these years, whether I did the right thing or not. It was a case with one lady. She was claiming, she said that she is Macedonian and that she comes from a particular city. And then they asked her to depict the city in a certain way, and they asked for certain things it was a very detailed questioning. And as she was talking, I realized that, first of all, the accent that she had, the dialect that she was using, was not Macedonian, was actually a Bulgarian dialect. But then I said, okay, it might have happened that she lived there. The second thing was that the way she was depicting the city was not the city that was in question. And so on and so on. So the interrogation went on. And of course, I did interpret as everything as she said. So I didn't say anything. But then at the very end, as you know, there is a paper in which we have to sign, you know, in order to get our money. And then there was a space in which there were comments on the side of the interpreter. So I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do now? I mean, this lady is apparently not from the country. She doesn't speak, that the dialect that she's speaking is not spoken there, because I happen to be a linguist, unfortunately for her. So, and also to be a local as well. And secondly, the city and everything. And I just didn't know what to do. So I was like, I had this very big ethical question in me, like, should I make a comment, or should I just kind of, okay, I did my job and that's it? And I don't know, there were kind of few minutes I was thinking, and then I said, well, all I can write is maybe that her language should be reconsidered. That was the only question, the only remark I made, and that was it. So now I don't know whether I did the right thing or the wrong thing, or what should have I done. Thank you.
You know, I mean, here's the sort of irony of it all, is at some point we want interpreters to be more involved and to be visible and to be responsible, and that creates a sort of a responsibility. On the other hand, one of the reasons why, you know, that interpreters like to say, I have nothing, I'm just the interpreter, that they don't want to have to answer those kinds of questions, right? They don't want to be asked those questions, right? They don't want to be, you know, I mean, look, there were lots of interpreters who were being asked all the time to just check whether a person's language was authentic. And there's been a lot of criticism raised on that note, because first of all, accent, you know, how do you know? How can you say for sure? I mean, I'm not questioning you. Yeah. I'm not questioning you. I'm just saying, you know, this idea that an interpreter, if they start having to make those kinds of judgments all the time, you know, they're going to get it wrong sometimes, right? You know, I'm not saying you got it wrong. I'm just saying, you know, so to avoid that kind of situation, you know, and, you know, I always go back to this interpreter that I've quoted many times, who said to me, he was from Georgia, you know, the country, and he was interpreting for Kurdish refugees in London, and he said, I was toward, he had refugee status. He had been given refugee status. And he said to me, I hear them, they some of the ones who say they've been tortured, I know they've not been tortured because I've been tortured and this is what it feels like. And you can't, you know, they say they hung, you know, I mean, I don't even like to talk about the details, but, you know, he was basically saying, I hear them and I say to myself, that person has not been tortured. And then he says, and then I hear others who have been tortured, and I'm sure they've been tortured. And in the end, sometimes the one who's been tortured gets asylum, and sometimes the one who hasn't been tortured gets asylum. It all depends on the credit, because it all centers around credibility. And his way of ending that was to say, you know what? I don't care, because I get it. It's not up to me to decide whether someone's a liar or not. You know, I can have my personal views on it, but I wouldn't say that person's a liar, because I know why they're lying. They want to get status. And I don't know anything about their lives. Maybe the person who's lying is also really in trouble in some way, you know, but isn't in trouble in the right way, you know, that conforms to this, you know, the Geneva Convention or something like that. You know, it's just very complicated. And so I feel like, it's a personal choice, really. You know, it's a personal decision what you do, and then you live with it as you're living with it. You know, and I'm that's all I can say. I mean, I don't know what I would have done in a similar situation. You know, and it might be different. If you were working with a lawyer, you know, it might be different wanting a lawyer to know something about somebody. And again, I don't even know about that. Like, there's a lot of interpreters that would show up at a lawyer's office and say, I'm not going to say anything other than what I'm, you know, but then there's other people who work with lawyers who might feel that it's their obligation because they're sort of part of a team to say, you know what, I'm really not sure about that person's story. You might want to ask a few more questions, but there's no harm yet done, because it's a matter of the lawyer and the client, and there's confidentiality issues there. But do you know what I'm saying? So the context might make a difference as well. So I don't know that one should be a perfect anything, and that there's a straight set of rules to follow, you know. But I mean, I think it's a great example though of, you know, you're human and you were just sitting there thinking like, this is just a load of, you know, and you just felt like a moral obligation, something about it felt unethical. Yeah. And again, that's your, you know.
Differently this time, but at that age, as you feel like you should tell the truth or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's very complicated. You know, it's very difficult. Very difficult.
Thank you very much. There is one question from the audience. My question would be about the vicarious trauma that community interpreters experience. Do you think that we, as the interpreting industry, are well prepared to grapple with this? At the end of the day, it is necessary to think about the well-being of interpreters and the sustainability of the industry. Thanks, Oktay Eser.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's kind of what I was saying earlier about, you know, absolutely, you know, so that interpreters should not bear the burden of responsibility about somebody's fate. I mean, that yet they are so involved in it, right? So at the very least, they should at least be getting the same kind of time out, you know, to you know, engage with, you know, for, you know, as part of their professional, you know, rights in a way, you know, to, if they need to be able to see, you know, counselors but of course, so much of interpreting is done freelance. It's really hard, you know, that's one of the things about the Medical Foundation, that they were able to organize and create and you know, state their you know, their needs, and they were so valuable and invaluable to the foundation that they got them what they wanted, you know. But it took a lot, even there, it took a lot for them to, you know, to be able to get that kind of help and support, you know. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the problem with freelance work. You know, you're on your own, kind of, right? But I mean, the principle of it, I absolutely, totally agree with.
And as far as I know, if I'm wrong, please correct me, Mrs. İngileri and Mrs. Diriker. Well-being has turned into a chapter in the recent book, Routledge Handbook of Conference Interpreting, right? I may be wrong, maybe, but if I'm wrong, please correct me. So it shows us how important well-being has become in recent times. We have a question, one more question from Seren Üstünda, and let's say this is the last question. Thank you very much for joining us. Seren, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this amazing talk. And I have to say that I'm not an interpreter or not a translator, but I am interested in translation studies, and I'm actually working on translation in novels, but in a way that how, at least in Kurdish context, how character translate themselves to the audience in the Turkish language. So I wanted to just like basically ask you, isn't it I mean, when we think about the narration that we are seeing in the photography, it's actually, we can actually think that the novel can give the same thing without, the person who is making the translation is not a translator or an interpreter, he's a writer or she is a writer. So I just wanted to, because when I was listening the previous question, I was thinking that if a lie is a part of the narration, so how, I don't know. So I'm so sorry that I have no idea about the interpretations and translation as a job, but I was thinking that even the lying is a part of the narration. It becomes a fiction because it comes from an experience. So it turns into a lie too, but it is a part of the story and the narration. So I don't know where lie begins and the truth starts. So I was thinking with the novels, and I really would like to hear something from you about that. I don't know if it makes any sense. Thank you very much.
So I think what you're saying is that if you're saying like the untruths are part of the narration, then am I right in thinking that sort of what you're suggesting is, does it matter that it's, I mean, if it's the narration that is front and center, then whether it's true or not is irrelevant, right? Because it is their truth. Their lie is their truth.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of what I think I was sort of suggesting, that if it's their truth, your personal views are not relevant, right? And you just act as if it's a true story. That would be one way of going about it. It's different than fiction because the fictional account is being read by a reader, and most of us, when we're reading something like that, are millions of miles distant from anything actually, any consequences, right? So it's very different, to think about and in a way, this is. Isn't sort of this the problem that goes back in time, that the translator cannot be anything but, a traitor, because they're either telling a lie or they're telling someone else's lie, So it's a complicated, these are complicated issues. I think that though, and look, in my, again, going sort of just back to the research when I was doing it in England, there were people there were immigration officers who told me that they knew when an interpreter was not, okay, let me give you this example. An interpreter from a country who's in conflict, where there's a civil war, and you're working, actually I worked with a Somali interpreter. She worked with me on one of my projects there. And when she would go to interpret, the first thing the person would ask her was whether she was from the north or the south, because they were embroiled in a civil war. And if she said, I'm from the north, but I'm here as an interpreter, I'm not going to, cast any judgment. I have no say in your narrative. I'm just going to speak, your truth. That it was very, very difficult for sometimes the people to believe that. But then there were also cases where the asylum officers would tell me that they were present when they knew that the interpreter, and judges even told me this, that they were present, and when they knew that the interpreter was hostile, physically, hostile, and attitudinally hostile to the person that they were interpreting for, because of their views of them, and sometimes these were Turkish and Kurds, sometimes they were Gyps and Roma and Eastern Europeans, I mean, you could just go on and on. Like, people are in conflict in the world, right? And so that conflict shows up in the interpreting, triad. Even it can be so strong that it's even noticed by the by the people who are, you know, sort of there kind of in the neutral in terms of that anyway, you know. And I remember a judge telling me, calling this interpreter, she used the word a predator on this Roma that was in her court, you know. And one of the ways he did it was just simply moving his chair further away from the person, like in a hostile kind of way. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah. You know, it's the narrative is, yeah, the narrative is there, but there's a lot of ways of embodying narratives, right? So, or, you know, or distancing yourself from them without speaking a word, right? And that's kind of interesting as well. I guess you could describe that in a novel, and that would, but when it happens in the flesh, you know, it's interesting, yeah.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Mrs. İngileri. Thank you very much for this insightful talk. And I'd like to give the floor to the Dean of Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences of Istanbul Atlas University, Gülşen Sayın. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Özüm. Thank you. Thank you, Professor İngileri, for this remarkable and hilarious talk. It was great. I feel uplifted really now.
Great.
And I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank everybody now who is with us now. I'd like to thank the Department of Translation and Interpreting Studies, the head of the department, and all the members of the department. I'd like to thank our research assistant, İlknur Ülker, and our webinar series will go on. We'll let you know. We'll keep informing you. We'll be together with other distinguished professors in our webinar series. Thank you once again, Professor İngileri. Thank you very much for this beautiful
Thank
talk.
you. And thank you for all the great questions. And it was a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.